Coups don't start with tanks in the streets. They start like this. Quiet conversations, subtle changes, people who used to be loyal, acting differently. And in Russia, there's one group that matters more than anyone else. The Siloviki. The men who actually hold the power behind the scenes. And right now, something inside that circle is shifting. The signs aren't loud. They're not on billboards or state TV. But they show up in courtrooms, in sudden arrests, in a capital city that suddenly can't get a mobile signal. In the silence of officials who used to speak with one voice. None of it is a coup. Not yet. But for the first time in over 2 decades, the question isn't whether Vladimir Putin is strong, it's whether the people who keep him in power still believe he's worth protecting. And to understand why the question is even being asked, we need to talk about who the Siloviki really are. Because once you see how this circle works, everything happening inside Russia right now starts to look very, very different. The word Siloviki comes from the Russian word sila, meaning force. It's not a political party, it's not a club, it's a category. The men whose entire careers were built inside institutions that are legally allowed to use violence on behalf of the state. The FSB, the successor to the KGB, military intelligence, the investigative committee, the prosecutor general's office, the interior ministry, the National Guard, the Presidential Security Service. These are not the men that you see giving the press conferences. These are the men who decide who gets investigated, who gets arrested, who gets surveilled, and when the moment requires it, who simply disappears. For most of the Putin era, scholars and journalists have argued that this group is the real spine of the Russian state. Some call it a militocracy. Others, less politely, have called it a mafia in uniform. But the most important finding from years of research is this. The Siloviki are central, but they're not unified. They're made up of competing networks, rival clans, overlapping loyalties, and personal grievances that go back decades. They cooperate when the system is winning, and they turn on each other when it isn't. And for over 20 years, Putin has played them against one another with extraordinary skill, handing out ministries, contracts, immunity, and protection in exchange for absolute loyalty. It worked. For a long time, it worked beautifully. Until it didn't. The arrangement was simple. Putin would give the Siloviki everything that they wanted. Power, wealth, protection from prosecution, the freedom to enrich themselves on a scale that would have ended any career in a functioning democracy. In return, they gave him absolute control. They became the enforcement arm of the regime, crushing protests, jailing opposition figures, eliminating critics at home and sometimes abroad. It was a transaction, and as long as the transaction kept paying out, no one had any reason to break it. Political scientists have a name for this kind of system. They call it patronal politics, a regime that runs not on laws or institutions, but on personal relationships, patron-client networks, and one critical assumption, that the man at the top is going to keep winning. As long as elites believe the patron is going to stay in power, they align behind him. They compete for his attention. They denounce his enemies. They protect his interests as if those interests were their own. But the moment that that assumption begins to crack, the moment that elites begin to suspect that the patron may not keep winning, the whole calculus begins to change. Loyalty stops being free. It becomes conditional. It becomes a hedge. People start quietly preparing for what comes next, even as they publicly insist that nothing is changing. And in Russia, in 2024, something started to change. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Because systems like this don't usually break in a single dramatic moment. They break in small signals. And the first signal came from the very top of the Russian military. In May of 2024, Putin did something that almost no one expected. He removed his long-serving defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, a man who had run the ministry for 12 years, a personal friend of the president, and arguably the second most visible figure in the Russian government. Shoigu wasn't fired. He was kicked sideways, appointed Secretary of the Security Council, a polite ceremonial demotion. His replacement at the Defense Ministry was Andrei Belousov, not a general, not a security veteran, but a quiet technocratic economist who was tasked with rationalizing a defense budget bleeding from the war in Ukraine. And then the arrests started. Within weeks, Deputy Defense Minister Timur Ivanov was detained on corruption charges. The Carnegie Endowment described his arrest as breaking a taboo. For the first time, the unwritten rule that elite figures of his rank were untouchable had been violated. Ivanov was convicted in July of 2025 and sentenced to 13 years in a maximum security prison. Then came Pavel Popov, then Dmitry Bulgakov, both former deputy defense ministers. Both were detained. Both were pulled into a widening dragnet that was no longer about fighting corruption. It was about systematically dismantling the network of one specific man, Sergei Shoigu. The Carnegie Endowment described it as a coordinated campaign, a deliberate top-down effort to break a clan that had grown too rich, too powerful, and too independent over Shoigu's 12-year reign at the ministry. Chatham House came to a similar conclusion. The Kremlin was preparing for a long war by purging anyone who couldn't deliver, and using the purge to redistribute control over the most lucrative arteries of the wartime economy. Generals were getting arrested. Procurement officials were vanishing into pretrial detention. Entire corruption schemes that everyone in Moscow had known about for years were now suddenly being treated as crimes against the state. And the unwritten rule that had governed elite life under Putin, that you could steal as much as you want as long as you stayed personally loyal, was being rewritten in real time. And then, in March of 2026, the fourth name dropped. And this one cut closer to Shoigu than any of the others. On March 5th of 2026, the Russian Investigative Committee announced charges against Ruslan Salykov, Shoigu's first deputy defense minister from 2015 to 2024. His longest-serving deputy, his shadow, the man who had followed Shoigu through every position he'd ever held. The changes were not minor. 12 counts of large-scale embezzlement, 2 counts of bribery, money laundering, and, most damningly, leading a criminal organization that had been stealing from the state budget continuously from 2017 through 2024. The Basmani District Court placed him under house arrest the same day. The damages, according to the investigative committee, exceeded 6.5 billion rubles, roughly $83 million. The case centered on a defense supply company called Voentorg, accused of funneling inflated contracts for the most ordinary military supplies. Uniforms, hygiene kits, underwear for Russian soldiers, through layers of intermediary firms designed to skim cash. The man responsible for outfitting the Russian army had allegedly built an industrial-scale theft operation underneath it. And the message inside Russia's elite was unmistakable. If Salykov could be taken down, if the man closest to Shoigu could be arrested, charged, and paraded through the courts, then no one inside the old defense ministry network was safe anymore. Pro-war Russian telegram channels, normally cautious about elite affairs, openly celebrated. One Russian commentator, the economist and State Duma deputy Mikhail Delyagin, claimed publicly that corrupt officials inside the defense ministry may have stolen as much as 11 trillion rubles over the years, roughly $140 billion at current exchange rates. Now, whether or not that figure holds up, the political signal didn't need verification. The fourth deputy was down. The dominoes were still falling. And the man that Salykov had served for 2 decades, Sergei Shoigu, was sitting in his Security Council office, watching his entire former network be dismantled around him, with no way of knowing whether his own protection still held. And while all of this was unfolding inside the courts, something else was happening in the streets of Moscow that almost nobody outside of Russia fully understood. On March 6th of 2026, one day after the Salykov charges, Moscow's mobile internet went dark. Not for an hour, not for a day, but for 3 weeks. Across central Moscow and large parts of St. Petersburg, residents woke up to phones that wouldn't connect. Taxis couldn't be ordered. Card payments stopped working. Navigation apps went blank. Couriers stood on street corners holding paper maps. Pagers sold out across the city. The world's most digital capital was suddenly running on stationary phones and shouted directions. The Kremlin's official explanation was security. Ukrainian drones, they said, were getting more sophisticated, and the mobile network needed to be jammed to stop them. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov confirmed on March 10th of 2026 that the disruptions would last as long as necessary, and casually added that the presidential administration itself had switched to landlines. The State Duma's Wi-Fi went down. Lawmakers couldn't reach their own messaging apps. Even Max, M-A-X, the state-backed messenger officials have been promoting for months, glitched out inside the parliament building. Russia's most used app, Telegram, was reportedly being fully blocked from April 1st of 2026 onward, accessible only through VPNs. The blackout in Moscow was lifted on March 25th, But St. Petersburg was hit immediately afterward. And by early April of 2026, mobile internet across the country had become unpredictable in a way that it never had been before. The economic cost was staggering. The Internet Protection Society calculated the Moscow blackouts alone were costing the local economy roughly $120 million per day at peak. In 2025, Russia was already ranked first in the entire world for internet shutdowns, over 37,000 hours of disruption, an estimated cost of nearly $12 billion. And here's the part that should make every viewer pause. Because if you've been watching this and finding it useful, hit subscribe. Fall of Nations digs into the stories that most channels miss, and what comes next is the part of the story that almost nobody is telling. Because the official explanation, drone defense, it doesn't hold up. The drones kept flying. They kept hitting their targets. The blackouts didn't stop them. So if it isn't really about drones, what is it about? The Institute for the Study of War, a respected American think tank, published a report just before the Moscow blackouts arguing that the Kremlin was accelerating its internet crackdown to preempt domestic backlash, to insulate the regime ahead of decisions that were likely to be unpopular at home. In other words, they're not building this system to stop Ukraine, they're building it to stop their own people. Chatham House analysts went further, describing the blackouts as something closer to a stress test, a deliberate effort by the Kremlin to refine the mechanics of digital isolation, modeled on what China and Iran already operate. And the architecture is now nearly complete. Telegram, blocked. WhatsApp, restricted. Signal, gone. In their place, the Kremlin is herding ordinary Russians into a state-backed messenger called Max, pre-installed on every phone sold in Russia, widely understood to be monitored by the FSB, and increasingly required to access government services, school chats, even local utilities. These are credible reports that even senior Russian officials are nervous enough about Max's surveillance capabilities that they keep separate phones and SIM cards just to install it. In February of 2026, Putin signed a law granting the FSB the authority to order telecom operators to suspend services on demand, with no court order, no public explanation, no appeal. This isn't a wartime improvisation. This is a permanent kill switch built into the legal code, tested in the regions, and rehearsed in the capital. And here's what no Russian official will say out loud. A kill switch like that isn't only useful against protesters or Ukrainian drones, it's also extraordinarily useful against rival elites who may try to coordinate during a crisis. Cut the mobile network in central Moscow for 3 weeks, and you don't just inconvenience commuters, you also make it nearly impossible for anyone outside the state's whitelisted communication channels to organize anything fast. Which brings us back to the Siloviki, and the question that's now hanging over the Kremlin like a storm system that won't move. Loyalty in Russia has always been transactional. The Siloviki served Putin because Putin delivered wealth, protection, status, impunity. But the war in Ukraine has been grinding for over 4 years now. Sanctions have stripped away foreign assets. Casualties keep climbing. Defense procurement has become a minefield where any signature could become a court exhibit. The clan that ran the defense ministry for over a decade is now being systematically destroyed. Their assets are being seized. Their families are being investigated. Their former colleagues are watching it all happen, calculating whether they'll be next. In patronal systems, this is the dangerous moment, because elites don't betray a strong patron. They betray a patron they no longer believe will protect them. And that calculation is now happening. Silently, privately, behind closed doors, across the upper layers of the Russian state. Transparency International ranked Russia 157th out of 182 countries in its 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index, a score of 22 out of 100, the worst result in the country's modern history. That isn't just a statistic. It's a description of a state where every senior official has something that could be used against them, where every contract, every signature, every offshore account is potential leverage, where the only thing standing between you and a prison cell is the personal goodwill of the man at the top. And that goodwill is now being demonstrated very publicly to be revocable. The Siloviki aren't a unified bloc. They never were. They're competing factions, military intelligence against the FSB, the Prosecutor General's office against the Investigative Committee, old KGB veterans against younger Putin loyalists, the old Defense Ministry network against the new economic technocratic team that Belousov has brought in. Each faction has its own clients, its own protected businesses, and its own shared secrets. And when one faction gets to feed on another, as the Siloviki case shows is now openly happening, the survivors don't just feel relief, they feel exposed. They start asking the one question that authoritarian rulers can never afford their inner circle to ask. What happens when it's my turn? And once that question gets asked, it doesn't go away. It spreads. It infects every meeting, every appointment, every late-night phone call. It rewires the entire system from within. And history shows that no amount of surveillance, no internet kill switch, no pre-installed state messenger can fully suppress it once it has begun. This is the moment to talk about what a real coup actually looks like. Because most people picture tanks, generals on television, captured palaces. That's not how it works in modern authoritarian systems. Coups are insider events. They happen in conference rooms and encrypted messaging threads, not on the streets. They begin with senior security officials reaching agreements with senior military officers, with key bureaucrats agreeing to look the other way, with rival clans temporarily aligning around a shared interest in removing the leader before he removes them. The August 1991 coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev is the textbook case, and the textbook lesson. The plotters, hardliners from the KGB, the military, and the Interior Ministry had the institutional power to seize control of the state, but what they lacked was coordination, public legitimacy, and the willingness to use overwhelming force. The coup collapsed within days, but it fatally weakened the system it had tried to save. And within months, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Modern authoritarian regimes have learned from 1991. The discipline is called coup-proofing, the deliberate fragmentation of coercive power so that no single institution can act alone. Putin has done this with surgical precision. The creation of the National Guard, Rosgvardia, in 2016, was a textbook coup-proofing move. It pulled the Interior Ministry's combat units out of one chain of command and placed them under a separate one, reporting directly to the president. It created a counterweight to the army. It ensured that no single security agency could mobilize on its own. The system was specifically engineered to make a coup almost impossible. But coup-proofing has a hidden cost. The more a leader fragments coercive power to prevent betrayal, the more elite distrust he generates. The more rivals he creates inside his own security apparatus. And the more the inner circle starts to resemble what Stalin was in his final years. A court of nervous men watching each other, waiting to see who falls next. Real warning signs of an actual coup attempt would be specific and institutional rather than rhetorical. Sudden, unexplained reshuffles at the top of security services. Abnormal troop deployments around Moscow involving units whose loyalty is critical. Abrupt breaks in the state media narrative suggesting the center has lost control of messaging. And preemptive detentions of senior figures designed to neutralize rivals before they can move. Some of these signs are not yet visible, but others, the prosecutions, the communications crackdown, the visible nervousness inside the elite, already are. So what is actually brewing inside the Kremlin? Honest answer, 3 scenarios are credible right now, and one of them is the one nobody wants to say out loud. Scenario 1, managed rebalancing. Putin uses the corruption purges to reshape the defense establishment, redistributes control over wartime contracts, tightens information controls to prevent destabilizing coordination, and rides out the war with his grip intact. This is what most Western analysts assume is happening. It's the safest bet. Scenario 2, controlled succession rehearsal. The Kremlin quietly tests the legal, informational, and institutional mechanisms that would be needed to manage a leadership transition, without admitting that that's what they're doing. The internet blackouts, the FSB shutdown law, the centralization of communications onto state-controlled platforms. All of it could just as easily be infrastructure for a transition as infrastructure for a war. Scenario 3, escalating elite conflict that gets out of control. Anti-corruption cases that started as discipline become weapons in factional warfare. The Siloviki case isn't an isolated event. It's evidence that one clan is actively destroying another, with the Kremlin's blessing. But factional wars and patronal systems have a way of spiraling. Today's prosecutor becomes tomorrow's defendant. Today's untouchable becomes tomorrow's example. A genuine coup attempt, the dramatic 4th scenario, remains the least likely outcome. The system was built to prevent it. The coercive institutions are deliberately fragmented. The communications infrastructure is being centralized under direct state control. The men who could plausibly organize one are being prosecuted, isolated, or replaced. But the conditions that historically precede coup attempts are no longer absent. They're visibly present. Wartime stress, elite purges that no longer respect old protections, a leader visibly fragmenting his own security apparatus, a capital city being conditioned 3 weeks at a time to live without horizontal communication, and a regime as opaque as this one. By the time the outside world sees a coup, it'll already be over. The system hasn't broken. Russia is still a functioning authoritarian state with a leader at the top, a security apparatus that does obey, and a population that, at least publicly, doesn't protest. Nothing in this script suggests that Putin's removal is imminent or even probable. But the people who do hold the system together are not behaving the way that they used to. The fourth deputy is in court. The capital city is being conditioned to live without communication. The FSB has been handed a legal kill switch. The Defense Ministry's old guard is being hollowed out one prosecution at a time. And inside the Siloviki, the silent communication has begun. Whether the man at the top is still the safest bet, or whether protecting him has started to become the dangerous one. Every authoritarian collapse in Russia's history has begun this way. Quietly, invisibly, with the inner circle changing its mind long before the public ever noticed that anything was wrong. The 1991 coup didn't come out of nowhere. The pressures that ended Khrushchev built up for over a year before the Politburo finally moved. And in every case, the people who actually decided the leader's fate were not the public, they weren't the army, not the protesters in the streets. They were the men closest to him, the ones who had spent years swearing that they would never turn. The Siloviki are those men today. And whatever they decide, they won't announce it. They'll simply act. So here's the question that we'd love to hear your answer to in the comments. Do you think Putin will finish this decade in power? Or do you think the cracks that we're seeing now are the early signs of something much bigger? Drop your take below, and if you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because the next move inside the Kremlin may not be public, but it will change everything.